Depending on who you ask, Camelot Software Planning are either the Mario Sports developers or the Golden Sun developers. But both sides are wrong, because Shining Force is awesome! This studio did a lot of work before they started working with Nintendo. So many great titles that are basically ignored by most people, because talking about Golden Sun appeals to the algorithm more than a retrospective on Beyond the Beyond. It's kind of sickening that the story of this developer is seen as starting in 1999, instead of giving proper recognition to all of their work with both Sega and Sony. But I'm no better, because here I am with my first video on this studio. So Golden Sun, this is a trilogy that started on the Game Boy Advance, and the first game was quickly followed by a sequel on the same hardware. Unfortunately, I don't own the third game, so I had to use a substitute. But it's easy to see why Golden Sun resonates so much with people. The days of 16 and 32-bit JRPGs had pretty much ended by 2001. Nintendo fans especially were deprived of the genre, as it pretty much skipped the Nintendo 64, and all Nintendo had were whatever they put onto the Game Boy, which were unfortunately ignored because there was only one JRPG on the Game Boy that everyone played. So there were two main groups of people who got exactly what they wanted at the perfect time. There were the kids who were more than likely introduced to the genre with Pokemon, and they wanted something a little more complicated. And there were also the older people who played these games all the time in the 90s, and they wanted something a bit more nostalgic instead of all these fancy 3D RPGs. It's a good thing Golden Sun stuck the landing. We're immediately greeted with a name entry screen for our protagonist, and then immediate drama. The typical starting town we're in is ravaged by a storm, and the debris effectively walls us in for a very direct tutorial. It's all pretty standard, and honestly it gives the opening moments mechanically a very slow and limiting start. But this is easy to forgive since the drama and atmosphere bolster it. While seemingly incidental, this brief opening moment is key, and I wouldn't remove it if I had the power to do so. This opening moment shows our protagonist as a weak child who can't really help those in need. He's basically helpless to the world around him. And after some tragedies befall people he cares about, we get a time skip to him being much more adept in being an adept. We get a better understanding of why he pushed himself to master his skills, and best of all, this opening introduces the overall plot and some important characters, but we see so little of them that it's an intriguing mystery. It's a small taste of what's to come. Though a few seconds ago I did say adept. What does that mean in this game's context? In layman's terms, it's an elemental magic user, though the game specifically calls it synergy. The elements here are earth, fire, wind, and water, which are all easy to understand, but instead they're all referred to in-game as Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Mercury. I'm personally not too familiar with various astrological readings of planets, so associating Mercury with water is weird to me, but eventually it gets drilled into your brain. And if not, the game does color code these, which does help significantly. Our protagonist is an adept with Earth synergy, and in what is not a surprise to anyone, we get a party of 3 other members who represent the other 3 synergy. Pretty standard stuff, though there will be much more to keep it from feeling generic later. But first, the generic opening needs to be wrapped up. While our protagonist and his friends are exploring the opening dungeon of the game, the Soul Sanctum, a little whoopsie happens, to put it lightly, and among many other plot points, some of the team exploring this temple are kidnapped by those same people from the opening moments I briefly alluded to. And worst of all, these strangers acquired all they needed from this sanctum to achieve their goal of relighting the 4 beacons across the world, which in turn would seem to wreak destruction. This much is explained by a legendary being referred to as the Wise One, who saves our now party of 2, and explains the dangers that could befall if these beacons are all lit. So that begins our quest. Stop the beacons from being lit, and while we're at it, save our kidnapped friends. Now it's time for 2 17-year-olds to explore the world, but that's okay because they recruit one more person their age, and also a 15-year-old. But that's fine because JRPG characters all become useless once they hit 20, this is them at their peak. These 4 likely heroes have an entire continent to explore, with many towns sprinkled across with their own cultures that mirror our own, since that's easier than creative writing, but at least each is distinct and helps sell the journey. The towns and various dungeons all make great use of the synergy the game is basing itself on. We have puzzles everywhere, and as someone whose introduction to the genre was Lufia II, this is exactly what I wanted. Give me more block-moving puzzles in every RPG, I don't care how out of place it is. While we can push things by nudging them with our character sprites, the scope is expanded upon significantly thanks to the magical powers we all have. Carry heavy objects, freeze water, used wind synergy to create a tornado to clear the way, instead of, just using your hands or even your weapons. Some of the puzzles do get quite complex, especially late game or in the optional areas that can be as hard as they want to since it's not required. It helps spice up dungeons a lot, and its implementation was near perfect, though it is hindered by the fact this is on a Game Boy Advance. It is clunky to select the specific spells we need in the menu, and it is alleviated somewhat since we can shortcut these to the two shoulder buttons, but over the course of the game, you'll be swapping these shortcuts quite a few times, and since there are only these two buttons to work with, it does mean you'll probably need to back into the menu and do the slow method quite a lot. And given this game's love of hiding things behind the one spell that shows invisible objects, you may as well keep that one spell locked in its shortcut, which does limit how great this all could be. But this is basically part of the course for Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games. It's nothing shocking, but it's something you just need to put up with. Since spells you can use while exploring are still part of the same synergy system that combat uses, these too cost magic to use. And while this sounds like the worst system imaginable, due to magic usually being a valuable resource in games like this, the game does have a solution to this. Here, walking restores your MP, so it's never really drained for long. This system, which is here to prevent you from getting stuck in a dungeon, has a ripple effect, and it means fancy attacks or supportive spells like healing can be used freely, provided that you still give it enough time for it to restore. But that small decision, with many others, helped make this one of the most engaging combat systems of the genre. And while there is a lot of depth here, it kind of takes a backseat to the beauty of these battles. A lot of people dismiss the Game Boy Advance as just a portable Super Nintendo, and it does make sense since the library is largely SNES ports, or games that look like they're from that system. But in certain regards, this is a much more powerful system. Obviously music capabilities got neglected the hardest, but what the GBA can accomplish can outdo the SNES by a lot. It's just that we didn't see it often. And on a surface level 90s console war mentality, the Super Nintendo was 16-bit, but the GBA was 32-bit. Do the math! Golden Sun shows this better than a lot of games in the system's library, and it's even more impressive since this came out in 2001, the same year as the handheld. Battles move the camera constantly to show better action and to better frame everything. We get to see the characters' fronts and backs, and it's in about as seamless a transition as you could expect, considering just the technology they're working with here. And this game even goes the extra mile to show what weapons are equipped. If your character's wielding a sword, an axe, a mace, or etc., it will be represented. That's not even super common in JRPGs of this era, and here it's even more impressive. Attacks look sharp, they're fluid, and we have some cinematic specials that go above and beyond what the GBA honestly should have attempted. This is just cool, and best of all, my Game Boy Advance didn't catch fire trying to render it. And while it's nowhere as impressive, when we're moving on the overworld we get a small rotation, which is just the metaphorical chef's kiss from me. Bravo, this game looks amazing. Outside of the fancy effects, we still get detailed character portraits, and the cute touch is that character emotions are represented with these small visual cues during scenes. These characters truly feel alive, even though my therapist repeatedly tells me they're not. And while on the topic of being shallow, the music is really great, especially considering what the Game Boy Advance hardware is. I'd go as far to say this music is some of the system's best. And while that isn't hard to accomplish, the compositions are fantastic bops in their own right, and would sound amazing if they actually had hardware to go with it. Everything here is great, with one exception. I have a confession to make. The footage you're looking at is not how Golden Sun would look on most displays. It's been color corrected to better resemble how it was made for an original GBA screen. Like many Game Boy Advance games, this had to overcompensate for that terrible screen with no backlight. And if played with a backlit display, Golden Sun looks overly vivid and saturated. With the color correction, it does go a little too much in the other direction, but I'll still take it. Regardless of if you side with blinding lights or a more realistic, albeit boring look, things do still look great here. But if that was the extent of the game's merits, it wouldn't be remembered as anything more than a technical marvel. The rest of what's here is what elevates it in people's hearts. While the initial goal of stopping the beacons being lit is always your main objective, a lot of other quests naturally present themselves, and in particular one drives the last portion of the main story. However, I'm more intrigued by the game's use of optional objectives. One in particular, rescuing the adoptive father of Ivan, one of our main characters, is entirely optional, and Ivan's here on your party the whole time, so he'll know if you're slacking off. Though he also does realise the immediate stakes of the world's potential end are a bit more important than rescuing one kidnapped man, so either way you can rationalise your choice. But this is still presented as an important part of the story, and our characters' lives, and you basically have to go out of your way to do this. I can imagine a lot of first-time players didn't even know this was an option. But we don't have a fast travel system here. If you want to go from town to town, you are walking there. And the geography and available bridges basically funnel you through a linear pathway where you never need to backtrack. It's not even an option during multiple points of the game's story, and since everything is basically a guided trip through the available landscape, which is really just a single line, this way of designing a map means the lack of fast travel is never an issue if you're just following the path and completing this linear story with no second trips to previous towns. However, towards the end of the game, the option to backtrack is thankfully gifted to us via bridge technology, and while not a deal breaker, if you choose to explore for optional goodies, you'd almost certainly want a warping spell or something. It's in this late game optional backtracking, the player can go for 100%. Side quests are available, and small puzzles you couldn't solve due to not having the right synergy are finally opened up. But best of all, there are optional dungeons here, and in RPG tradition, the hardest dungeon of the game is entirely optional, and its boss is much more difficult than the final boss. But hey, you can flex! This was a cool thing to do on the playground 20 years ago. You can tell everyone you beat that one boss that you don't have to do, but now everyone's done it, or at the very least are familiar with it. Who cares? You think you're cool for showing footage of it? Yeah, what is this, 2002? The main reward for all this optional stuff, beyond a feeling of smugness, is we get extra items and more importantly, more Djinn. These are what gives us our magical abilities and lets us class change. You can get away with collecting only the bare minimum of these, but there are so many out there and it just feels nice to have options, and more importantly, a bunch of living beings in your own pocket. These Djinn represent the 4 elements mentioned earlier, and you can assign any of these to any characters. By mixing and matching these, the character's list of attacks, their stats, and their elemental weaknesses and resistances change. Ivan may be a Jupiter or Wind adept by nature, but you can force the Earth Djinn onto him just as an example. There are lots of pros and cons to each combination. Some may want mono-elemental characters, while some may want to mix 2 or 3 different elements with them. And while I'm sure there are people out there that have written long essays on what classes are factually the best, it does never feel like there is a best. It's just a player's perspective of what they want at that time. Ideally, what you assign each character with is always in flux, especially as more options present themselves. But it also results in a game where multiple different people can play it and have entirely different character builds. Or your own replays can feel nothing alike in battle. The Djinn aren't just passive class-changing elements, however. There is another layer they add, and damn, it feels so good to use, especially in the harder bosses. Each has a specific use which can turn the tide of battle by using them, but using them does also exhaust them for some turns, which in addition to meaning you can't use the same ability for 2 turns in a row, also means you temporarily lose the benefits of that Djinn which usually results in lower stats mid-battle and even a class change, which can make your options worse for a bit. However, using them does also add to your reserves for your summons. More destructive attacks, which can do many times the amount of damage a normal attack would, are at your disposal if you first weaken yourself and limit your options temporarily. These aren't things you'll need to worry about most of the game, but if an encounter seems too hard, in particular bosses, do this to change your strategy. Grinding isn't the answer here. You can also start a battle ready to unleash these in case you want a meteor to crash into the planet on the very first turn. But by doing that, you are still starting off weak and have to wait a while to get the regular spells and attacks you'll want. This whole combat system is so robust and I love it. The rest of the game could be terrible and I'd still defend it for the combat. That's what we call the bravely default syndrome. But it's not, the rest of the game is still amazing here. This is a really solid RPG that has very few faults, with the main ones just being the fact that it was made for the Game Boy Advance, which as much as I personally love it, I know it is not a flawless system. One problem in particular does arise from the hardware the game had to be constrained to, and this is that Golden Sun isn't actually the complete title the devs initially planned. This is a grand story, and to keep it that way, it had to be cut into 2 halves. This entire game is just one chapter, which the sequel built off. Because of this, our big climactic ending in this single entry is more of a climactic middle, which is really dramatic, it's great. But once you beat it, you kind of realize, the actual story of the game has not been resolved. But since they knew a sequel had to be made, Golden Sun was built to maximize this potential, with either a link cable or somehow an even more incredible password system. You can transfer everything to the second installment. This means your side quests weren't in vain, they'll get mentioned in the second game, and if you want everything carried over, there is a 260 character password waiting for you. There are other options in case you don't want to bring over literally everything. But no, I want the exact inventory of my characters in the second game. So type 260 characters, realize you made a mistake, restart, and you have everything ready for the sequel. The end of this game is beautiful, even if it's not really a proper conclusion. And as our characters board the ship for a new land, with another chapter of the game ready to unfold, it really does make you think, this is just how Shenmue ended. Over the last 20 years, Golden Sun is still such an impressive feat. This was the perfect game at the perfect time, and it really did show the power of the GBA without overdoing it and just giving us an impressive tech demo that doesn't play very well. And because of its landmark title, Camelot were able to work with Nintendo to do more than just Mario Sports titles for a few years before being thrown into the Mario Sports making dungeon. That's actually kinda sad. Well, next time you play a Mario Sports game that you don't like, just remember, there is a timeline where Golden Sun games get to exist, and at least those people get to be happy. You on the other hand, no, you get Smash Bros being a consolation prize, take it or leave it.